Exploiting L1 for the learning of L2. Now we are moving on with the conclusion of the article and talking about how does it support the use of first language in the learning of the second language. It is argued that the interrelationship between the first language or the second language is much deeper, and it needs to be exploited at that depth rather than at the surface level. Rather than just talking about the lexical items or the grammatical structures, their relationship between them is much stronger. Actually, all languages, because they operate to perform the same function in the society, within the culture, instantiating, we say instantiating means representing the culture, resurrecting, reinforcing the culture of the place they belong to, they perform the same function. And if the functions that they perform are similar or the same, then there is a connection between all languages. And we need to exploit that same function. We need to exploit their relationships for easing the language learning process for our learners. So, role of L1 as prior knowledge will always be used by the learners based on the simple fact of human information processing. This is the way we process information. Remember, even in connectionist models also, we talked about how the knowledge in the mind of the learners, and you have several computer programs modeling that kind of model. One thing leads to the other, and how different groups of points then come together to integrate into a larger pattern of learning. So it allows you, it facilitates the perceptual mechanisms that are already working in your brain by legitimizing a certain level of the use of L2. It aids memory and it facilitates learning. It is also argued that the learners must not be deprived of the opportunity to use their language. There are two reasons for it. Firstly, we said it helps in learning the new language, but the other reason is also not less important, and that is that it somehow legitimizes the identity of the learners. It allows the learners to look upon their own social identity with respect as they move to the learning of a second language. Please remember, research says that when second language learning is a language of power, it's an official language of power which few people know, and if the first language of the learner is looked down upon, then the second language learning anxiety becomes too much for the second language learner. It becomes more difficult. So the point of teaching a second language is developing bilingualism. It is to allow the learners to use more than one language, that is their first language, and then go on to learn a second language, bilingualism. The aim of teaching a second language is not to eliminate the first language. We don't want our learners to forget their first language and to use only the second language. We just want them to be rich bilinguals, add on to their repertoire of languages they know, because it does not help them to forget one and learn another, and they still end up with only one language. So it is argued to encourage that bilingualism, to allow the learners to see that both languages are all right to use. We need to exploit bilingualism in teaching strategies, allowing connections, comparisons, and contrasts both in formal functions of the language and the meanings of the language, and also the cultural associations that they bring, that certain vocabulary, certain grammatical structures might bring. This would also allow the learners to see that not everything from one language is translatable into another language. What is it that we lose in a translation? Because if any given language, somehow reflects the culture of a specific place, then that means it is located within that culture, grounded within that culture. And when you're learning a second language, if that culture is very different from yours, then that language might not have the kind of structures or the kinds of flexibility to explain what has been expressed in your first language. So, because both languages sort of operate in their own cultural context. And this is what we need to make clear for our learners. But this does not mean just using Urdu, using grammar translation method in your classrooms. It means after you have done your communicative language teaching, used in a lot of English, allowed the space for the learners to use English language or any second language that is being taught, then you move on to add on this component to it. So it's not random, it is planned use of L2.